Hello, everyone that's here. We're just going to wait a few more minutes to let people get in. We'll just wait a few more seconds and we'll get started. All right, looks like we've got a good number of people who are in, so I'm going to go ahead and get things started. Welcome to ADAPT, the State of the St. Johns River. I'm Brendan Rivers. I'm the lead reporter for ADAPT from WJCT Public Media. ADAPT is our project focused on how climate change is affecting Northeast Florida and what's being done about it. Please sign up for our monthly ADAPT newsletter to make sure you're the first to read the in-depth original reporting that I do on a monthly basis now, and find out about more events like this one. You can sign up after the event at adaptflorida.org. Tonight's program is co-presented by WJCT, Jacksonville University, and the Jacksonville Environmental Protection Board. I want to go over some housekeeping before you get into the panel discussion here. Audience members will be muted throughout the event, but if you have any questions for our panelists, please feel free to type them out at any time in the chat window, and make sure you mark them as a question. We'll try to answer as many questions as possible before we wrap up tonight. You can also interact with each other in the chat window, but we will only be taking questions that have been marked as a question. If your question's for a specific panelist, please be sure to include their name in the question. Okay, I would now like to introduce our esteemed panelists. We've got some great people here with us tonight. I'm very excited to have all of you. Quentin White is Executive Director of the Marine Science Research Institute at Jacksonville University. His current research focuses on how human activity is affecting the St. Johns River. Dr. White serves as a consultant for the City of Jacksonville's Waterways Commission, and he's a subject matter expert on the City Council's Special Committee on Resiliency. Thank you for being with us, Dr. White.
Great to be here.
We're also joined by Melissa Long, Chief of Jacksonville's Environmental Quality Division, whose work focuses on water quality issues. She joined the city in 2014 after more than a decade with the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. Thank you for joining us, Ms. Long.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
District 9 City Councilman Garrett Dennis is with us this evening as well. A native of Jacksonville, he's been on the council since 2015, and he currently serves on the city's Special Committee on Resiliency as chair of the Subcommittee on Infrastructure and Continuity of Operations for Essential Services. Thank you for being here, Mr. Dennis.
Thank you for having me.
And finally, we're joined by the St. Johns Riverkeeper, Lisa Reineman. Ms. Reineman has spent close to a decade now advocating for the St. Johns River and working with government officials, businesses, and residents to resolve problems that affect the river's health. It's great to have you here with us, Ms. Reineman.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, Dr. White, as the resident scientist this evening, I'd like to start with you. I know these reports are very comprehensive and detailed, and we had this event earlier. It was an hour and a half talking specifically about the findings in this report, but I'm sure not everyone in here right now was able to attend that. So could you briefly walk us through some of the main findings in the new river report?
Thank you, Brendan. Appreciate that, and thanks for hosting this, and appreciate the WJCT and the Environmental Protection Board for sponsoring it. When you challenge me to do something briefly, I do an entire course using this as a book. So, that's 15 hours. So it's actually 45 hours. I'm thinking about it. But this was a very, very comprehensive report. and I encourage people to take a look at it. And if you cannot look at the entire report, see if you can look at the executive summary and the brochure that comes out that they put in that sort of summarizes what we'll call the river health indicators. In general, the report classifies things in sort of 4 general areas, if you would. One is aquatic life. That's sort of looking at what's out there. It's the submerged aquatic vegetation, what we call macroinvertebrates, the shrimp, the clams, the oysters, and things like that. Looks at wetlands. That's one of the trouble spots in the report because we're showing a decline in wetlands, and wetlands are critically important to the ecology of the St. Johns River. Good news, it also includes the manatee, and the manatee is one of our success stories. I've been working on manatees now for, 30-some years, and very proud of what we've seen happen in Duval County and around the world, and much in Florida. We've gone from when, frankly, 30 years ago, I thought the manatee would be extinct in our lifetime, and we now have a thriving population, so it can be done. A problem that's beginning to emerge more is what we call non-native species. We get a lot of invasive species coming into Florida in general and in the St. Johns River. And these involve a host of things, different mollusks, different crabs, different fish. Some of these are brought in as exotics for people for the aquarium industry, and they're discharged because they get too big for the tank, and so they put them out the tank and the river. And that's becoming a bigger problem because they're competing with our native species. The other group of, or area, I should say, of discussion is contaminants. This is all the pollutants that are in the river. And they also cover some of those when we talk about water quality in general. And in general, we're having problems and lack of data with a lot of our contaminants, the so-called polluters. And we need more work on that. There are some things that are stabilizing, what we call metals. These are heavy metals that have been used in industrial processes in the past, and they are fairly stable. And sort of at this point, conditions unchanged is probably a good thing. We also look at fisheries. And fisheries is maybe the one area we have the least data on, believe it or not, in some respects. Florida Fish and Wildlife is doing more and more work here, but it's a relatively recent addition to what we're doing. We're seeing some things improving, but by and large, we just don't have enough information about what's going on with all the species. The biggest quality, or the biggest category, if you would, is water quality. And with water quality, this is where you start looking in the things you hear people talk about pollutants, things like nitrogen and phosphorus. And these are the ones that we measure. We also look at turbidity, algae blooms, things like that. Good news is that the nitrogen are doing better. I think JEA can be commended for much of the work that they've done to remove nitrogen from sewage outfalls, but we still have problems with leaking septic tanks and things like that. We've also got a problem because we're starting to see phosphorus increasing in the estuarine portion of the river. I also remind people that St. Johns River is an estuary. It's, we go academic here for a second. It's a semi-enclosed body of water open to the ocean, but diluted with fresh water. That means that we have a pipeline coming into downtown Jacksonville open to the ocean with unlimited salt water out there. And so it mixes together here, and then we get progressively fresher as you go upstream. And what we're seeing is that the nitrogen in the tributaries is getting better, the nitrogen in the main stem is getting better, but the phosphorus is not getting better. And we're not exactly sure why. It could be increased runoff. It could be people doing things like blowing leaves into the yard or off the yard into the street. That's one of those things we sort of need to do more work on. We have not seen a huge algae bloom this year, but we thought we might, but we somehow managed to dodge that bullet, and so we did not see a big algae bloom. The other thing that we're beginning to see is fecal coliforms in the tributaries. These remain, I'll say, unsatisfactory, and a lot of that has to do with septic tanks and the problem there. The other bigger problem has to do with the salinity of the river. Because it's an estuary and we get this mixing of fresh and salt water, and we have this unlimited amount of salt water in the ocean just offshore, as we change the flow of fresh water into the Jacksonville area and we deepen the river to increase the salinity, we're seeing the salinity move further and further upstream. What does this do? Well, for one thing, it impacts what we call submerged aquatic vegetation that would normally be occurring in the freshwater area. It gets killed off as the salinity rises. So it's a fairly complex problem. We're also seeing where historically we used to find that when it rained, because we had wetlands and that would hold some of the water and the water would gradually seep into the river, the salinity would gradually drop after it rained. Now, because of all the work we've done with rushing that water into the St. John's, then it rains and the salinity drops rapidly. And then once it stops raining and we go into a more normal or even a drought condition, what we find is the salinity rises very quickly because the wetlands are not there to act as that sponge to allow that water to come out. So that's sort of a fairly broad overview from about 60,000 square feet, 60,000 feet to look at what's going on. But the report is extensive. This is the 13th year. Very proud of the effort that my colleagues have put forth. It's quite an effort, and it's a huge amount of information. And it's critical that we continue looking at this topic in the future. So, Brendan, hope that sort of answered the question.
Very helpful. Thank you. And yeah, just so everybody knows, the event from earlier today was fantastic, and we should have a recording of that up on adaptflorida.org in the next few days here. So if you missed that and you want to watch it, go to adaptflorida.org later this week, and you should be able to see it there. Ms. Long, as someone whose job revolves around pollution and water quality, what jumps out at you from this new report?
So I was very happy to see that the trends in total nitrogen are showing some of the efforts in the area. Unfortunately, and Dr. White mentioned no algae blooms this year, but the report did show that we had some elevated blooms last year. So not seeing the algae kind of take that same trend as total nitrogen is a little bit disappointing. And it could have something maybe to do with the total phosphorus. So what's interesting to me is that back in 2008, when the BMAP was being established in the TMDL for the lower St. Johns River, the marine section was stated that phosphorus was not the limiting factor. We really needed to reduce nitrogen. That's why the freshwater section has to reduce both. And when the numeric nutrient criteria came out about a decade ago, DEP was saying that we just need to hold the line with phosphorus here in this area. And now I'm wondering if that's the correct assumption. Like, do we need to go back and look at that again to see if maybe that might be what we're seeing with these algae blooms? It wasn't unexpected, but disappointing. Our tributaries do have what we call fecal indicator bacteria, either E. coli or Enterococci. It's all over the place. They're really kind of unchanging, and it's disappointing because we do put a lot of effort in that I'll talk a little bit about later. And then the metals, that was something I was kind of wasn't expecting. I didn't realize that we had maybe some concerns with metals in the main as well as our tributaries. We do sample metals periodically in the main stem, but we don't sample metals anywhere in our tributaries. So it might be something we need to take a look at and maybe periodically do a bit more sampling there. So that's kind of some of the things that when I heard the report, that's what stood out to me.
Okay, thank you. And Ms. Reineman, what are your main takeaways from the new report, and what do these new findings mean for you and your organization?
Well, I think the good news is that we can save the St. John's. We've all collectively worked on reducing nitrogen in the St. Johns River, as Melissa and Quint mentioned, but there's still a lot of work to be done. The phosphorus is a major concern. We did see a lot of green algae outbreaks in 2019, especially south of Jacksonville. I know we've got some friends from Palatka on the line. We saw them down there. And so those are very troubling. As we all noticed, the tributaries, they are cause for alarm. And that's something we only can have a healthy river if we have healthy tributaries. And with rising water and climate change, saltwater intrusion, so that can undermine the efforts that we've made to reduce pollution in the St. Johns River. And so while we can celebrate some of the improvements, there are also some things that are troubling: the metals, the phosphorus. But with saltwater intrusion, sea level rise, more flooding, that brings more pollution in. We have to focus on resiliency to protect not only the improvements we've collectively worked on in the past, but also to help us have a fighting chance to protect the St. Johns River for the future. And that's what we're focusing on.
Okay, great. And panelists, we are hearing a little bit of an echo, so if you wouldn't mind when you're not speaking, make sure you turn your microphone off, and then when you are going to speak, go ahead and unmute yourself at that point. Okay, Councilman Dennis, the new report, as we've seen, highlights several worrying trends in the river. As a native of Jacksonville, what concerns you the most from what you're hearing?
Again, just want to thank you all for allowing me to be a part of this panel. As a native of Jacksonville, one of the things that I do want to just start off by saying that, even though we're dealing with a pandemic, one of the bright lights of this pandemic is that people here in Jacksonville and quite frankly all around, they're really getting into water, really enjoying our rivers and tributaries and things like that, and so that's a plus. But in saying that, we need to balance that with with good policies and making sure that our river is healthy. And one of the things that really stood out to me are the issues with septic tanks. And septic tanks have been an issue, like I'm a native. And so for years, and so since I've been on council, has been an even, bigger, becoming, a bigger issue. And so we're going to have to find ways to deal with it, to correct the septic tank issue that we have, because, as you all know, with failing septic tanks, that water, the pollution has to go somewhere, and it goes into our river. And so that's the thing that really stood out to me, being on the policy end and continue to fight, to get funding so we could phase out those failing septic tanks.
Okay. Excuse me. So one issue that was brought up a couple times in the report and in the presentation earlier was the dredging of the St. Johns River. And it looks like people in the comment section are already bringing this up. So I think the audience is very interested to hear about this. So Dr. White, how is the ongoing dredging affecting the river now? And what do you think the impact will be once the project is done?
Well, it's a long-term process. I'm sorry. It's a long-term process that we're going to gradually see the salinity increase. And it's a balancing act right now between rainfall and the influence of harbor deepening. And we're actually running a little surplus water right now from rain. We're running a little wetter than normal. And so while we're not seeing dramatic increases, it's a gradual increase, and you're going to gradually see salinity move further and further south. What that impact means, as I mentioned earlier, the killing off of the submerged aquatic vegetation, but also causing things like shrimp to move further south, oyster beds moving, if they can move, clams, other animals like that moving around. Species of fish you might have found one place in the river, over the next few years, you may find them further upstream.
Okay. And I know the Times Union did a great piece a couple years ago now, I think, about how it could affect flooding. Is that something that you're worried about as well in the future?
Yes, in fact, we're already seeing that problem. And thanks for bringing that up. And that's going to get progressively worse. Combined with climate change and sea level rise, since we've deepened the St. Johns River, we've increased the amount of water that can come in the river. And I think Nate Monroe and Chris Hong had sort of described it as opening up the smooth highway to bring water in. I view it as a big pipe. And so you're enlarging the pipe and you can bring more water into the city. And so you're going to start seeing more and more flooding. We're seeing it right now, particularly during our new moons and our full moons. And we're in that new moon phase right now. So we're seeing higher than normal high tides. So we get the high. These are very high highs.
Okay. Ms. Long, this project has been a priority for Jacksonville for a while now. Is there anything that the city is doing to measure or document any of these impacts that Dr. White is talking about?
Yes. So not specifically to the dredging part, but for the last 30, 40 years, we have been measuring or taking samples in the St. Johns River. We continue to do that. So as was mentioned, salinity, we have it in several locations along the river. We continue to do that, as well as all the nitrogen, nutrients, DO, things like that. So we're out there about every other month, but at least once a quarter, to get the samples along various points along the St. Johns River. So that's what we're doing.
Okay, great. Thank you. Councilman Dennis, this year you voted to authorize a $70 million city contribution and a $40 million loan for the dredging. Why do you support this project?
As a small business owner, I looked at the financial impact of it, the jobs that'll be created. You have to balance that. You have to balance the cost and benefit. And so as I deliberated on the dollar amount and everything that surrounds the dredging, I fell on the side of supporting this because of the jobs, because of the economic impact. A famous saying from my from a mentor, the late Mayor Jake Godbolt. He said that a stagnant city is a dead city. And so again, I supported this as a city, continue to move, it's so fitting that we're talking about water, a body of water that's stagnant, things in that body of water dies. And so that's the reason why I supported it, to keep, business and the economy moving here in our city.
Okay, great. And a follow-up question for you, Councilman Dennis. Other council members say they're supportive of the dredging, but that some type of mitigation is necessary. Do you agree with that? And what can you and your colleagues on the city council do to help reduce any negative impacts we may see from the deepening of the St. Johns River?
We are policymakers, and it does take 10 votes, and 19 of us supported it. We need to, engage organizations such as the Riverkeeper, such as, the Jacksonville University, Marine Sciences, to help guide us to the various policies that we can implement to make sure that, the mitigation actually happens. I don't think, that we're turning over, $111 million, $110 million and not going to be a part of the process. So we need to lean on organizations that's actually doing the work and that's out there, advocating for a healthy river and water source.
Okay, and Ms. Reineman, you fought the dredging project for a long time, but I mean, it's pretty clear now that it's going forward. So what's next for the Riverkeeper on the dredge issue, and what do you think needs to be done to mitigate the environmental effects that people are anticipating?
Well, first I'd ask the City Council to hold the Army Corps accountable. The Army Corps, unfortunately, they underestimated the environmental impacts, and we are seeing impacts already. I was just talking earlier today to one of our members who is seeing the water, every time the tide comes in, it's coming in so much more quickly. He's seeing higher waters, his dock's underwater. And so we're seeing those impacts right now. So I look forward to further working with City Council members to hold the Army Corps accountable to protecting our river and offsetting those impacts. But we do have to work together because there are many projects that must be done to offset the impacts of the dredging. And it's twofold. It's the saltwater intrusion, as Dr. White mentioned. But what happens when you have saltwater intrusion, you have higher floodwaters. What's bringing it in is more of the Atlantic Ocean is allowed to come in. And so you get more saltwater intrusion that does damage to wetlands and grasses. Those are the kidneys of our river. They're also flood protection. You have more flooding that brings in more pollution. And so there's not one silver bullet to offset those impacts, but there's many projects that we have to be committed to. We have to make our community and our river more resilient by restoring tributaries, by taking septic tanks offline to reduce the pollution. We need to focus on protecting that freshwater contribution and flow to our estuary that'll protect those wetlands and grasses. And we can do that here in the lower St. Johns, but we have to work to make sure that conditions upstream in the St. Johns are the way they should be. And that will take working with Central Florida, make sure that we are all living within our water means with water conservation and not withdrawing fresh water from the Central Florida area that will bring in more salt water. We have to look at this at a holistic system. And one of the most important things we need to do to work together with everyone that cares about our waterways in Central and North Florida is restore the Ocklawaha River, which is the largest tributary to the St. Johns, which will offset a significant amount of this saltwater intrusion with restored wetlands, restored flow, and it reconnects the largest freshwater spring, Silver Springs, back to the St. Johns River. And so there's not a silver bullet, there's lots of work to do. But I know we can do it. We just have to collectively do it here in Duval County as well as all the counties upstream.
Okay, and I want to bring it back to pollution and algae blooms, which we were talking about earlier. Dr. White and Ms. Long kind of already talked about what some of those pollutants are, but Dr. White, can you tell us a little bit more about where these pollutants are coming from and how it impacts our community?
Dr. White, you're muted.
I'm sorry. Is that better? Thank you. As I was saying, this is where it gets a little complex because a lot of people associate pollutants with an industrial process and a pipe discharging water into the river. And we discovered beginning in the 70s that was really a very small percentage of the pollutants going in the water. Much of the pollutants going in the water are what we call sheet flow, non-point source pollution, things that are just sort of flowing into the river. It's when you drive your car and you leak and you wear rubber off your tires. And back when we used to have lead in our gas and it would rain and it would wash that into the water. And so we found that the pollutants sort of, and I'm going to put it in a couple of general categories, and Ms. Long may want to come on and comment along with this, but we sort of have the nutrients, the nitrogen and phosphorus, and they tend to stimulate things like algae bloom. They tend to decrease the clarity of water because when the algae blooms or we get increased turbidity, sediment in the water, the submerged aquatic vegetation cannot live. That means the animals can't live down there. They're not the nursery grounds for fish. But then you also have the more, and I'm going to call it the more insidious kinds of pollutants. It's the thing like the heavy metals, zinc, cadmium, mercury, lead, the things you associate with industrial processing. But they also come off and run off into the water, and they become part of the food chain. And so you begin to worry when they get taken up by the phytoplankton, then the zooplankton, and small fish, and then big fish. We catch the big fish, we eat them. We take the oysters, we eat them. We take the shrimp, we eat them. Well, they've been living in this soup of pollutants, and they get in our bodies. And so you've got some health problems. The Environmental Protection Board is working right now to try to understand the mercury, among other things. And so we've got not the best set of data on the river. We're still working on that. And so it's a very complex question, but those are the sort of the general topics, I think, when we talk about pollution and contaminants and what they do to the river.
Okay, and Ms. Long, the report was kind of a mixed bag when it comes to pollution. We've mentioned that there were improvements in nitrogen levels, but other issues are kind of still concerning. But it did find that local governments and partnering state agencies have managed to improve water quality to some extent. So can you tell us about what the city is doing to reduce pollution?
Absolutely. We have a huge reduction requirement through the Basin Management Action Plan for the Lower St. Johns River. So we have quite a bit more nutrients still to reduce than what even is out there right now. So one of the things that the Public Works Department and our Department for the Environmental Quality Division are doing is we're meeting quarterly. We're trying to figure out some of the low-hanging fruit. What else can we get to? Where do we need to look at a few things, such as like street sweeping? Street sweeping has known if we can get in there and get the sediments and the leaves and hopefully not grass clippings, but sometimes grass clippings out of the streets before it gets into our stormwater system, that we can keep those nutrients out of the river. So we're looking at expanding opportunities for street sweeping. We also recently did a microbe lift study on several of our ponds. We wanted to see if maybe our ponds could get a little more treatment so that we could make an impact on the tributaries as well as the river. Unfortunately, we do have the results in, and it didn't make a difference from our control ponds to our treatment ponds. But one of the things that we learned is where we do have wet detention ponds, the treatment is really good, much better than we thought. Our ponds are averaging right around 0.6 milligrams per liter. And some of you who were on the call earlier know that this region, our numeric nutrient criteria, well, it's not really that, but the total nitrogen for streams, the target is 1.54. So our stormwater ponds are at 0.6. That's really, really good. So one of the things that the Public Works Department and EQD are looking at is maybe trying to map where we have where we have stormwater that is collected and treated in ponds and where we don't. And then maybe focus on the places that we don't and see what little changes we can make. We might not have the room for a large regional stormwater pond in these areas, but we might be able to make little changes like with green infrastructure, maybe some rain gardens that reduce that amount of stormwater that's getting to the tributary or getting to the river. So we're looking at things like that. The Environmental Quality Division is also looking at modifying a little bit of our strategic monitoring plan on the creeks and tributaries. So one of the things we've been trying to do is really focus on where is this bacteria? If we get to the fecal indicator bacteria, where is it coming from? We have been chasing bacteria, is what it feels like, for decades and really not making much progress. So we spoke with the Department of Environmental Protection a couple years ago and kind of changed our focus. And instead of running anytime there was a bacteria about 10 times the limit, we said, you know what, we're not finding things there. Let's take 2 streams, 2 creeks that we want to concentrate on. And we're going to go up into the manholes. We're going to go up as far as we can to try to isolate where is this bacteria coming from. So I'm hopeful that we'll start seeing some improvements from that. It's a little bit of a frustrating bag because bacteria, it can be all over the place. And sometimes 1 minute it's there and 1 minute it's not. So it is a hard thing to try to get to, but we do partner with JEA and trying to work on finding if we have leaks or anything like that from their system into the stormwater system or things like that. So those are some of the low hanging fruit I think we're kind of working on right now. We are also trying to figure out a bigger picture because everything I just said is not going to get us to the level that we need to improve for total nitrogen. So we may need to look at helping to maybe invest in some more technology that JEA might be able to do for further reduction. So those are some of the things that we're looking at right now.
Okay, and you cut out for a second for me, so excuse me if you said this and I missed it, but I wanted to follow up. As Councilman Dennis noted earlier, one of the major sources of the pollution we're talking about are septic tanks, and there are an estimated 65,000 of them in Duval County. It would cost what's estimated to be $2.1 billion to phase those out. So what is the city doing to address the septic tank issue, and how can it afford a price tag on an issue that's just so expensive?
So yes, that's a huge question because we have committed, the city through the city council has committed $15 million into the first phase of this project, and JEA committed the same amount plus some. I think it ended up being right around 38 million to try to get to the first 3 neighborhoods. Unfortunately, the quotes are coming in much, much higher than what was anticipated. And it looks like right now with the money we have, we are going to be able to do, I think it's the first neighborhood and a half, maybe 3/4 of that next neighborhood. I'm not really sure. I'm not as involved with that project. It's more in the periphery. They just kind of report to me what we're doing. But even if we did all of that, the total nitrogen, if we're just talking about total nitrogen, we're talking about 0.4 metric tons. Our obligation is like 35 metric tons or somewhere in that range that we still have to make. So even if we were to spend all of this money on the septic tank phase out at least for total nitrogen, we're not going to get there as easily as we thought maybe we could with some of the septic tanks. Now, there's other reasons. If you have failing septic tanks, it's more of a concern. It can contribute, obviously, to bacteria, but if it's a functioning septic tank, then there shouldn't be an impact on bacteria. Now, regular septic tanks do nothing for total nitrogen. So I think we need to kind of think outside the box. I don't think we're ever going to have the money, even if legislation was to give us quite a bit more, which I'm hoping. There's a lot of grants out there right now that we can help expand our septic tank phase out program, and we can still work towards that. But I think we need to be looking outside of that particular box and look at maybe requiring advanced treatment septic tanks if you're within certain distances of water. That's a lot cheaper than trying to do mainline extensions with JEA and get to these properties. There's also distributed sewer now. So that's something that JEA would manage and make sure was functioning correctly with the systems that they have. But so it kind of takes it out of the homeowner's requirement like a septic tank would be, but it's still kind of a septic tank. The treatment would be in their backyard. So those are some of the technologies I know that JEA is looking into. We have been looking at that particular technology as well to see if that might be something that we could manage cost-wise. That to put in one of those systems might be $10,000 to $12,000 rather than, I think we're looking at one of these neighborhoods is $45 million all by itself, and the total nitrogen for that might be 0.2. But it does help. There's other reasons to do it. I'm just looking at the environmental part, but there are other reasons to do septic tank phase out. But when you're looking from an environmental perspective, a functioning septic tank is doing fine for bacteria, not so much for total nitrogen. So those are kind of things I think we ought to look at. Advanced septic tank treatment systems, distributed sewer, things like that I think we can get this a little bit more manageable in a little bit shorter time frame than trying to phase out all of the septic tanks. That's going to be way beyond my lifetime and probably my children's before we can have the money to be able to do that. But we really do need to make those changes earlier rather than later. I think that's a personal opinion, though.
Okay, and thank you for that great explanation of sort of how septic tanks, even functioning ones, can get nitrogen into the waterways. I don't think most people realize how septic tanks actually work. I used to be in a house with a septic tank, and I had no idea that was the case until I did a story on septic tanks for ADAPT. So if you're out there and you want to know more about how septic tanks work and kind of how they're causing some of these problems, I've got a story up there on adaptflorida.org. Go check it out. Ms. Reiteman, one of your main concerns is algae blooms. What do you think needs to be done about them?
Well, I just want to echo the sentiments on septic tanks. We have to do something about our septic tanks because even a perfectly functioning one is not keeping nutrients out of our waterways, and that's the root cause of these toxic blue-green algae. We also need an inspection program. You can have an inspection program, again, that's more on the bacteria side, but we don't even have an inspection program for our septic tanks. And we need to stop permitting septic tanks. Right now, the cheapest thing is preventing this pollution in the first place. And so at a minimum, not permit more septic tanks in environmentally sensitive areas. These are things that can be done. It's at the policy level. We need our elected officials talking, but we need to phase out the ones that we have because sea level rise is going to make more of them fail. And so we're going to have more nutrient issues. We're going to have more bacteria issues. And it's something that we need, to work and make sure we're getting dollars in from our state legislature as well as federal funding. There are other counties getting, tens of millions of dollars in matching funds that we need to go after in Duval County as well as other parts of the St. Johns River. But there's more. We need to focus on resiliency, the flooding. When you have floodwaters, you get more fertilizers into your yards, into the river, into the creeks. That brings more nutrients. We have old sewer infrastructure that's leaking. We had nearly 1 million gallons of sanitary sewer overflows last year, or in 2019. That was better than 2018, but still that's way too much pollution going into our waterways. And then we have to look upstream. Remember the St. Johns River is a 310-mile river, and so things that happen upstream impact us, like the fact that South Florida is trucking their sewage sludge or biosolids to the headwaters of the St. Johns and disposing it there. And so I think that's something we need to address because not only do we not have a handle on nutrient pollution within our watershed, the state is permitting pollution from other parts of the state to be dumped in our watershed. And so the only way we're going to protect the St. Johns River from blue-green algae is working with elected officials throughout the watershed to take a stand for the St. Johns River, and have the local elected officials working with the state ones, and happy to do that to make sure our voices are heard to stop the threat of toxic green slime.
Okay, yeah, Councilman Dennis. So as we hear, there are plenty of sources of pollution that we're dealing with here. And history has shown that pollution can be effectively reduced through legislation. What has City Council done to control pollution here, and what can we expect from you and your colleagues going forward?
Councilman, you're on mute.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great question. And under the leadership of Councilman Carlucci and Council President Hazuri, we started the Resiliency Committee. And then we've broken out into subcommittees, and we're really looking at resiliency and how that affects the grand scheme of things of our river, of this sea level rising, and how we could make good policy in order to help encourage very smart development, and then how we look at some of our old developments and how we can help those older areas with resiliency. And so we've done a lot as far as policy, but not enough. I was looking at some past legislation since I've been on council. In 2016, there was one where we provided $1.9 million to the St. Johns River Management on a drainage system rehab down the Crystal Springs area, and that was in 2016. There's another bill that we passed where we went into an operating agreement with the State Department of Environmental Protection to work on air quality, which I know we're not really talking about air quality here, but we've done things. I mean, we partner with the state agencies. We've put in money from our general fund to assist with pollution. I'll give you another one that we just appropriated $1.5 million just recently for the McCoy's Creek restoration. And my district covers McCoy's Creek, and part of McCoy's Creek is very polluted. And like Ms. Reineman said, that we have to hold the Army Corps of Engineers' feet to the fire, as we move forward with the drainage project at the port, because it was the Army Corps of Engineers that spearheaded the McCoy's Creek project some years ago, and now we're dealing with it 20, 30, 40 years later.
Okay, thank you. So Dr. White, the report points out that wetlands are being lost. That's one of the major concerns that was outlined. Why are wetlands important to the river's health, and what impact is their loss having?
Right. Well, I think Ms. Reineman mentioned earlier, we talk about the wetlands being the kidneys of the water system, the river. And that's because they're the filters. They're runoff that would normally run off and sort of slowly filter through the wetlands. Turbidity is removed, that's a sediment, nutrients are removed, and so the water's cleaner when it comes into the St. Johns River. The other thing is the wetlands act as a sponge. They absorb water when it rains a lot, and then when we go through a drought, it gradually allows it to be released back into the river. And so that moderates the salinity shifts. One of the things we're seeing now with the harbor deepening, coupled with the wetlands, as well as the water withdrawal, or the loss of wetlands and the water withdrawal, is that we're seeing dramatic drops in salinity when it rains, dramatic rises in salinity when we go through a drought. And so it's critical that we try to protect these wetlands. The other thing is with climate change and sea level rise, these wetlands are being slowly inundated with water and covered up. And because we've hardened the uplands, in many cases, we're not getting more wetlands. We're reducing them because they're getting flooded, and then we've built right up to them, and people want a bulkhead. So we couple that with the septic tanks. So oftentimes we put septic tanks in some of these low-lying areas. Now when the water level rises, that brings the water table up, and the septic tanks don't work the way they should, and they release more nutrients, more bacteria into the tributaries. So trying to protect wetlands is critical, and it's one of those things that's very complex, and it's a very involved system with a lot of permitting agencies, and yet we still see wetlands being destroyed at what I consider an alarming rate when we understand how important they are.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to leave my camera off for now. It seems I lose audio whenever I turn it on for a few seconds. So Councilman Dennis, in addition to being on the city council, you manage a local construction company. What kinds of policies are in place here to protect ecosystems like wetlands from new construction?
A great question. There's policies in place for erosion control to make sure, that we're not losing, soil, as well as any contaminants from the construction site is not going into the drainage. Also, there's policies where, in larger construction projects where there's major water runoff, such as chill water and things like that. There's policies where you have to put that water in holding tanks, wait for all the metals and things to fall to the bottom of the tank, and then you dispose of the fresh water there. So there are policies in place to help that, and with the great work of the EPA holding construction companies and different developers feet to the fire to make sure that they are following the regulations. And so we have policies in place, but it's not enough enforcement.
Well, I'll go ahead and talk a little bit more too about, because Councilman mentioned construction and the erosion and sediment control. We, the Environmental Quality Division, have inspectors that do go out to try to make sure the exact same thing happens. We actually do a pre-construction meeting with somebody to make sure they've got the right erosion and sediment control in there. We also try to go at least midterm and then at the end to make sure everything worked out okay. And when they're next to a water body, we actually try to get out there more frequent. So anybody who might be a construction worker that's seen my crew and say, no, you're out there way more frequent than that, it might be because you were next to a waterway. And we do quite well. It's part of our MS4 permit, or it's our stormwater permit that we do. And we do make sure that people have protection. And the requirement is that you actually have multiple BMPs in place when you're near sensitive areas like wetlands, because we don't want those filled in with the erosion and sediment from the construction activity. So that's one way we're trying to protect our wetlands. Another thing I think we need to start thinking about, and this is more of a water management district and a Department of Environmental Protection thing, but if you saw the maps earlier about most people now, when they're going in and they're filling wetlands, they're not trying to necessarily stop doing that. Instead, they just want to mitigate, and they put it into a mitigation bank. And I think somehow we've got to stop some of that from happening, because those mitigation banks where they're located are way off the river. They're not going to help the same way that the wetlands help that are right next to us. So can't do a whole lot about what's lost now, but one of the things I think might be a good idea is to have someone kind of go through and evaluate our river and our tributaries, various banks that might be supportive of a living shoreline type of idea, and hopefully maybe get that idea, that information out to the public. So when they are making a application for a bulkhead or something like that, that maybe somebody can talk to them about the possibility of a living shoreline. They're beautiful sometimes, and it is really better for our environment if we can go with the living shoreline. One of the things the Environmental Protection Board did recently, and I think it's wrapping up now or just wrapped up, is the zoo project. There's a living shoreline out at the zoo. so that we can see it in action and see what it looks like, and hopefully maybe get that word out to people that you don't just have to hardline the river, hardline the tributary that you're on. Instead, we can maybe look at living shorelines, and that would help hopefully restore some of our wetlands. But we have to have some kind of paradigm shift on the construction and the fill of our current wetlands. And not just that, it causes flooding next door. You know, a lot of people have lived in a particular neighborhood for quite some time without any issue at all because the wetlands next door were doing their job. Then we go and we fill them in, and we have problems with it from an environmental standpoint because water's going everywhere, and the construction person, poor person, they can't handle the amount of water that's coming onto their site, much less what's going off. So those are some of the things I think from a regulatory standpoint we can start looking at. It is more of the Water Management District and Department of Environmental Protection purview, but we have to start having those conversations with them about maybe that paradigm shift. And I think if we did have a consultant that could put together a preliminary report about, because living shorelines don't work everywhere, but they work in a lot of places. And I think if we kind of knew where they might be a good substitute, it would be a good starting point.
Okay, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, sorry about that. I switched over to a different computer. Luckily, we have an amazing panel tonight. Sounds like you guys just picked up without me.
Picked up.
I don't even need to be here. Okay, Miss Reinman, did you get the chance to discuss wetlands and submerged aquatic vegetation yet while I was gone?
No, and I would just like to add, I agree with Melissa, living shorelines, you know, there's so many opportunities to do green infrastructure where you actually use nature to not only provide water quality filtration, but also to provide more resiliency and flood protection. And it's nice. You know, right now in downtown Jacksonville, we have the opportunity to, with all of this open riverfront, to be one of not only the most resilient waterfronts, but have beautiful park spaces that respect rising waters and can protect our city and actually make our downtown, you know, not only more resilient, but a great place to be. So I think living shorelines, green infrastructure, but on the submerged aquatic grasses, you know, those are not only important water quality filters, it's important habitat for our fisheries. And so, you know, we depend on recreational and commercial fishery. We are a river economy. And what we have to do is protect that delicate freshwater balance. The St. Johns River is a spring-fed river. And unfortunately, spring flow has been reduced 30%. And so as we're getting less fresh water into the system, more salt water due to dredging and sea level rise, we have to do something to offset that. And that's where we can focus on not only water conservation, using less water so we protect our springs that provide that critical freshwater source, but also restore the Ocklawaha River and that natural connection that will restore freshwater flow naturally to the St. Johns.
Okay.
And if I can piggyback, that's something that my subcommittee, infrastructure subcommittee, the resiliency committee, you know, we've been looking at those, you know, natural, you know, shorelines, and instead of the bulkheads, you know, because bulkheads become expensive, and then you have to, the upkeep, and then not only that, if a storm comes, and we all know that we're going to have sea level rise, and will that, you know, bulkhead be in, appropriate some years from now. So I think that's, you know, a new, like that paradigm shift Ms. Long was talking about, you know, really looking at, at those living shorelines versus, what we've done in the past. And so, that's one of the things that we really took a hard look at, and really, we're going to put in policy to, let that be the go-to first before the bulkhead. So
thank you for adding
for bringing that up.
If I also,
go for it.
Also comment for a second. I'm watching some of the questions that have been popping up in the chat room. A little conversation, a little bit about both the wetlands as well as these stormwater retention ponds that have been created. The stormwater retention ponds do in fact help in terms of gathering water and filtering it, but they need maintenance because they are in fact filtering. We're starting to accumulate toxic materials in the base, and they end up getting a lot of nutrients there. And so we've got to work on how we treat those. I'm also, in terms of the Special Committee on Resiliency, I sit on the Environmental Planning Subcommittee. And we spent a lot of time talking about the relationship between the wetlands and the destruction of wetlands and the septic tanks and the stormwater treatment ponds. These things are all related. And we've got to do a better job of understanding how they work and maintaining them. I'm afraid so oftentimes homeowner associations or sometimes ponds are created for neighborhoods and then there's nobody responsible for them. And so it's a balancing act that we've got to continue to work on. And regretfully, it's going to take some money. So that's sort of where we are right now, I think.
Okay, great. Thank you. We are getting close to 8 o'clock. I want to make sure we leave time for audience questions. So I'm going to move on to individual actions. Most of the challenges we've discussed tonight are pretty massive in scope. And we're probably going to need buy-in from major players in both the public and the private sector to find meaningful solutions. But is there anything that we can do as individuals to help protect the river, Dr. White?
Absolutely. And I think that's the thing I try to make sure people understand. So oftentimes people go, oh, this is such a massive problem. What I do doesn't make any difference. Actually, what you do makes a huge difference. And if you can incorporate what you do with what other people do, we can work together. And we've seen this repeatedly. I mentioned earlier about manatees, and we turned that corner and we've actually recovered manatees. We've done the same thing for some fish species, redfish, the spot-tailed bass. And so it took the action of a few multiplied by many. And so it's looking at little things. How do you live your life? Look at the amount of energy you're using. Look at the amount of water you're using. Look at how much fertilizer you use and what kinds of fertilizer you use. One of the questions I saw in the question was asking about kinds of fertilizer and herbicides. Yes, there are environmentally friendly herbicides. There are environmentally friendly fertilizers. Here in Florida, you don't need phosphorus in your fertilizer. And so you see the three numbers, that middle number should be a 0. So if you get a 10, 10, 10, you want something like 606 or something like that instead. And so you can also make sure that you're not blowing your yard clippings into the road, because when it rains, they just wash into the stormwater system and away they go. We have no idea how many miles and miles and miles of stormwater sewer systems, if you would, or pipes going straight into the river exist, because it's the way we built communities for years and years and years. The other thing you can do is become politically active. Talk to your city council people. Talk to your state representatives. Talk to your congressional representatives. Let them know that what they are doing matters and that you want to see the environment protected. They listen to their constituents. And the more you talk and the more you friends talk to them, the more action we're going to get. So that's sort of a start.
All right, great. Thank you. Councilman Dennis, I believe you've lived in this community your whole life. Have you seen individuals make a difference here?
Absolutely. Each and every neighbor, just like Dr. White said, from the neighbor, fertilizing their yard, from the various cleanups. And, if I could, since I've been on council, if I could, take this opportunity just to give kudos to Ms. Reineman. She was, somebody that came in, as soon as I, was elected to start educating me on the river. I've always lived here, always, love water, love fishing, love enjoying the water, but not really understanding, what it took to keep it healthy. And so, I just want to take this time to say, to thank her, publicly. But, it's people like her and her organization, and even, staff, like Melissa, so there's so many people to name, but, my hat's off to, again, Ms. Reineman, because, she was one of the first ones to really educate me. And so it's people like her. And so, we have to, continue to put one foot ahead of the other, for our river, that we love. And so I just want to thank all of y'all for doing it, because I am a native, and I want to, I want this, the river and our asset to, be here for my kids and grandkids and great grandkids.
Absolutely. Speaking of Ms. Reineman, what opportunities does your organization offer for people who want to get involved?
Well, thank you for that question. Thank you, Councilman Dennis. We appreciate all you do and the ongoing conversation. And it's about exactly what Dr. White and the councilman said, getting involved. We have to be having these conversations. We have a river friendly program, so you can learn how to be river friendly. And it's the very simple things from not getting your grass clippings into the street, or just getting rid of grass, using native plants. Let's celebrate what naturally grows in Florida, where you don't need to water and you don't need to fertilize. We need to conserve water to protect our aquifer that protects our springs, which flow into the St. Johns. So being river friendly, but also getting politically active. We have a water policy group team. There's several of our members I see from our water policy group on the chat. And it's where we talk about these policy solutions that will stop pollution at its source. How do we prevent it? How do we work with our elected officials to give our river a voice and become active? How do we make sure that during elections that our elected officials know that our waters matter, to make sure we're working together, and to work with elected leaders across the state? Because remember, our watershed is 8,800 square miles, so we have to make sure we're working not only with folks here in the lower St. Johns, but also in the middle St. Johns River and the upper St. Johns River, because it's all connected and having a voice. At stjohnsriverkeeper.org, you can visit, and there's a volunteer link where you can tap in. And if you really want to just get out on the river, we have our river patrol that they get out on the water and look for issues, investigate issues. And we work with kids as well, because they are the future stewards. So we have many volunteer opportunities. Just find us at stjohnsriverkeeper.org, and we'll definitely find a way to work together to protect the St. Johns.
Great, thank you. And Ms. Long, what resources are available to people who want to take action and get involved with city efforts?
Well, we have a few different things. And some people said already be politically active, but we have the Environmental Protection Board here in Jacksonville. And I say get signed up on their newsletter, get information from them. If you can either send an email to epb@coj.net, or join the Facebook page. You can look on the Facebook page, and there is a post there to sign up in that area. I also encourage you to get involved in Keep Jacksonville Beautiful. They have a couple of river cleanups every year. It's not enough, but it's something to try to get that trash cleanup. And I kind of wanted to echo the same thing others have said. I made several notes here. I wanted to make sure people knew what they could do to help out. And that is the Florida Friendly Landscapes. Do something, if you have to fertilize responsibly, as was already mentioned. And one of the chats also was mentioning some of that. Irrigate responsibly. It's great for the Florida Friendly Landscape, because you don't have to irrigate as much. You don't have to irrigate at all, depending on what types of plants you put in there. And pick up your pet waste. If you have a dog, pick it up. And that's not just if you're walking the dog. I mean, at least be polite to your neighbors and pick up that pet waste. But if you have your backyard, we're so close to water everywhere we are, that if you have pet waste in your backyard and we have a rainfall, it's going to probably make it to the river somehow, some way through our stormwater system. So I just want to reiterate to do that. And we have several websites you can go to for resources at coj.net/fertilizer if you want to learn a bit more about fertilizer. And it has links to Florida Friendly Landscape as well, coj.net/irrigation and coj.net/scoop the poop. So I can talk about all kinds of stuff like that. And grass clippings, leaves, all of that, all of it. It's amazing how much bacteria and nutrients are in these kind of things. So we need to keep them out and educate your neighbors, your coworkers, your family, to let them know what they can do to help the river.
All right, great. And for those of you who just mentioned the link, if you can maybe type that out in the chat window so our audience members can just click on it instead of trying to remember it. But it's a little after 8, so I want to make sure while we've got you guys here, because you are all so knowledgeable, obviously, I want to make sure we get to some audience questions. So let's take a look. We'll see what people are asking. Okay, let's see. We got one from Andrew. So I think this would be for you, Ms. Long. He's asking, who's in charge of enforcement when it comes to these issues, and what are penalties for people or groups that don't comply?
So it depends on what section you're talking about. I'm not sure what he's referring to, but if it is erosion and sediment control, that is me. I do take enforcement. It's fairly hefty. I have a lot of contractors who don't believe that my fines are fair, and maybe they're not, but they are to me because it's protecting the waterways. And no offense, Councilman, hopefully. And as far as I know, we have not taken enforcement against you. But if you do have a water quality violation, which does not take anything when it comes to turbidity, you just have a little bit off there and you're going to be double the standard, almost guaranteed. It's an $8,000 penalty per day per violation. So it does depend on how far above the standard you are. But typically most construction sites, when we go out there and we take our samples and we're looking at water quality, it ends up being 8,000. We often, if they work with us and get everything going right away, we'll give them a good faith discount. I do want to encourage people to be quick at fixing it. So we do offer usually that 20% discount sometimes, but not for repeat offenders. If you keep on and keep on and keep on, then we take that 20% away. Hopefully that answers the question. That's the not so nice part of what I do.
Well, that's important work, though.
Very important.
And I just want to remind the audience, if you have questions, type them out in the chat window, and then there's like a little bubble next to where you type. If you just mark that as a question, we'll try to get to it. Let's see. We've got one from Arthur Bides here. I'm not sure who to direct this to. I would say probably Dr. White. Let me get this up. Is there anything that will address protecting surficial and Floridian aquifers that connect to the river and tributaries? Oh, yeah, you got muted. There you go.
Very good question. I got to watch that little blue light. That's a very good question. And part of the problem, the St. Johns River is in fact fed by springs. And we're withdrawing more water from the Floridian aquifer than is being replenished to it. And we don't even know how big the aquifer is. It's a very nebulous kind of mass of water down there. But the thing we can do is look at your own behavior. Look at how you're irrigating your lawn, as Ms. Long said. Look at the amount of water you're using. Be conscious of it. There's so many little things you can do to protect the aquifer. The other thing is, going back to our need of wetlands. Now, here in Duval County, we don't actually have any areas that recharge the aquifer. But in our surrounding counties, we do. And so they need to join with us and try to minimize the amount of impervious surface. Because as we're pulling more water out, we're also covering up the areas that allow the water to go back in. So it's going to take a conscientious effort. I'm going to be honest, I'm somewhat optimistic on this one because we're seeing a steady decline in the amount of water used. Part of it has to do with increased efficiency in some of our appliances and toilets and things like that. Here at the Marine Science Research Institute, we're actually using rainwater to flush our toilets. And so we're not relying on aquifer water for that at all. And so there's more and more of that kind of thing happening. You can install rain barrels to capture rain off your roof and then use that to water your shrubs and your flowers around your house. So there's lots of little things you can do, and they do make a difference.
Okay. And Ms. Bryantman, I think you're probably the person to answer this one. This is from Michael Woodside. If the flow down the Ocklawaha is in equilibrium, what difference do the dams make?
Well, I guess the first thing is it's not in equilibrium. What happens when the dam is in place, it holds water in a pool behind the dam. And so it severs that natural connection from the St. Johns River, Silver Springs, to the St. Johns River. And so that natural connection is key. And what happens when it holds it behind the dam, not only does it get warmer, the water quality it declines, it also is holding back water from 20 springs that are submerged under that pool. So when you have the restoration of the free-flowing Ocklawaha, it restores up to 150 million gallons of fresh water that flows naturally to the St. Johns. It's better water quality, it's clearer, it's cooler. And so it's it has a vast improvement. In addition, it restores more than 15,000 acres of forested floodplain and wetlands, which are the best biofilters that the river can have. So it's twofold. You can go to freetheocklawaha.com for more information, and I'll type that into the chat, and it has all those statistics as well as reports that back it up.
Also, when you create a large reservoir like that, the evaporation takes a huge amount of water out of the flow of the Ocklawaha.
That's right.
Okay. All right, and this is from Howard Dale. I'm going to try to get this. Let me see. Okay, here we go. So I think Councilman Dennis, I'm going to pose this to you first. If you don't know, I think Ms. Long might be the person who would know the answer. Howard says there is a profit motive at work to develop near wetlands. I think he's saying some argue that regulations are not reliable long-term to protect wetlands. Is there a program to encourage the granting of conservation easements or a tax deduction to protect wetlands and appease the profit motive?
I don't know the answer to that one. I'm not sure. I wish there would be. Maybe somebody else on the panel knows. I don't know. I'm sorry.
Well, you know, it's kind of interesting. We took a stab at this during the resiliency subcommittee. And again, you're right. You have to balance the, you know, the cost, you know, versus, you know, is it cost prohibitive, you know, to build, you know, with all of the regulations. So we actually talked about that this morning in the committee, because, you know, we want to encourage development. We want to encourage, you know, resiliency, but, you know, will a developer or that for-profit walk away because it's just, you know, they just can't afford it, you know, with all the regulations. So, and so what we decided to do, we have a group coming out of the Northeast to go over, you know, the financial impact of resiliency and how we can balance, you know, the financial impact and also the return on the investment of a developer or, you know, private. You know, it may not be a developer, may just be a private, you know, someone that, you know, a private homeowner. But you know, we will have to balance. You know, I do think that government is going to have to play a role. You know, whether it's something what somebody brought up today. You know, whether you know, we give rev grants for or tax breaks for developers here in the city, but not for private, you know, homeowners. So again, you know, it's something we need to look at, and it's something that you know, we have not, you know, that we have not done yet. So you know, I know it's kind of round around to answer your question, but it's a great question.
Okay, I think we got time for maybe one more question here, and so this one seems pretty appropriate given this is an ADAPT event. Get this broadcast here. Okay, so this is from Stephen White. I'll pose it to each of you, but I'll start with you, Councilman Dennis, since you spoke last and you're also a leader on this committee. Stephen asks, how does this conversation that we're having tonight relate to the City of Jacksonville's Resiliency Committee's work? How do you and all of you panelists, how do you feel about the committee's work up to this point? And Councilman Dennis, we'll start with you.
The city's resiliency. I'm reading the question here. You know, and I'll be honest with the panel. Before I was asked to be on there, I was a little resistant. You know, like, well, you know, my district really doesn't touch a lot of the bodies of water. But once I got involved and actually start, you know, hearing and understanding why it's important, I think we're doing great work. And so these past few weeks, we've been going over the adaptation subcommittee group. And so we're working on legislation, start changing zoning codes so we could, you know, actually put policy actually into our ordinance. So I think we're doing great work. But it's, you know, we also need money too as well. But I think we're doing great work.
Ms. Long, do you want to jump in on this one?
Yes, I think it's actually a direct thing with what we're talking about here and the resiliency. A lot of what we can do to be more resilient is going to help us with water quality in the future. If we have the wetlands, it's going to be right there. One of the things I failed to mention earlier, and I meant to, is that the Environmental Protection Board about a year ago started talking about, do we need to change Rule 3, which is our wastewater rule? We have manholes, we have lift stations that obviously have to be in low areas. but is there something that we need to do to maybe change some of our rules to try to avoid certain floodplains? Are there things that we need to do to make these lift stations, manholes, more resilient to the high tides? So that goes hand in hand with water quality and how the river is going to respond to those kind of things. Those are some of the things that we do need to think about for the resiliency. Like I said, wetlands, we've all talked about how great the wetlands can be, with not just being a sponge, but being water quality, filter type thing. So yeah, I think this particular conversation, as well as the resiliency, they all go hand in hand.
Okay, and Ms. Reineman?
Yes, I have to agree with Councilman and Melissa. I think they're doing great work. I want to commend all the council members leading this effort. And one thing I want to applaud is the involvement of so many citizens. When you look at these committees and you go on these calls, there are people participating from all walks of life, from all different parts of our community, and having a collective conversation on what we can do now, what we can do in the future to offset rising waters, because it will reduce pollution. It'll help water quality. But we have to do more too. I mean, one of the things we can't forget, we can't talk about sea level rise as a future issue, because remember, with the dredging, the Army Corps produced a 12% increase in water levels during high frequency storms. And those high frequency storms are going to be what's going to be flooding out the manhole. It's going to be flooding out septic tanks. And so I commend the effort. I think it's great work. And there's going to be a lot to do. I'm just so impressed with all the citizen involvement and all the councilmen's commitment to time to making this important conversation happen. And more importantly, to see real action steps coming out of it a little bit later this year.
All right, and Dr. White, I'd like to get your take on this as well.
Yeah, I'm going to agree with everybody else. I think Councilman Dennis is exactly right. The conversation we're having in the Resilience Committee and in the Environmental Planning Subcommittee is directly related to what we're talking about here. And, the wetlands, the septic tanks, the water quality issues, they're all there. They're all part of resiliency. We want our city to be able to respond to a natural disaster as quick as possible. So the more we can do to think about that and plan ahead, and in some cases, we may have to force some people to avoid taking profit on waterfront land because we need that for the greater good. It's going to be a hard fight. I'm going to go back to what I said earlier about get involved, talk to your city council people, talk to your representatives, get to know them. They care. They really do care, but they need to hear from you, not just the lobbyists that are arguing to get more pollution and more destruction going on.
Okay. Before we wrap things up here, I did want to give each of our panelists, just a few minutes for some closing thoughts. So Dr. White, I'm going to throw it right back to you. Is there anything else you want to share about the report or potential solutions to some of the issues that we talked about here tonight?
Well, I'm going to be a little bit of a broken record. I want to just encourage people to get involved. I want to encourage people to think about what they're doing. When you water your lawn, you're putting drinking water on your lawn in most cases. And that's a waste of thought on aquifer water. The other thing we haven't discussed at all tonight, and it's not really talked about in the River Report, is the impact of plastics. And so, again, think about how you're using plastics and single-use plastics, trash bags, the plastic bags from the grocery store, straws, the kinds of things that we use and throw away are ending up in our oceans, in our rivers, in our streams, and frankly, they're in your food chain. And you have plastic in your stomach right now. And so, in the grand scheme of things, there's so much we can do, but just something of paying attention to how we're living our lives.
Yeah, and I know the plastics issue was the highlight of this year's River Report. So there's a lot in there about it. They talked a lot about it at the event earlier today. So if you want to learn more about plastics, and it sounds like that's sort of emerging research, really, you can check out that video. It should be posted online soon. Ms. Long, I'm going to go to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Yes, I'll reiterate the plastics part, because one of the things I found interesting was they were saying that metals and other contaminants can adhere to those microplastics and float around and things. And so that might cause us some other issues later other than just plastics. But one of the things I did want to reiterate from tonight is that I hope people understand the takeaway is that this is a community involvement. we need to get not just the city of Jacksonville, not just JEA, but everybody who's part of this community working together to try to solve the issue for our rivers, to think about the fertilizer, the irrigation, everything that we've talked about tonight. And think about if you're close to a waterway and you don't live in a neighborhood where your stormwater is collected, or maybe even if you do, think about green infrastructure. Think about the Florida-friendly landscapes, the rain gardens, things like that that you can do to make an improvement in the river. And I think that that's the main takeaway. I want everybody to know they can make a difference. So thank you.
All right. Ms. Reineman, is there anything you would like to add?
Yeah, so just definitely want to agree with Melissa. You can make a difference. And I want to invite, we want to have this conversation. We really appreciate WJCT for hosting it, all the scientists pulling this together, and the Environmental Protection Board for sponsoring this report. But the only way it's going to really make a difference is if we continue to have this conversation. And so we are wanting to come out to the neighborhoods and come out to your civic organization. Any groups, a lot of groups are meeting virtually. We were happy to put on this presentation and continue this conversation throughout the neighborhood so we can take individual action and protect our tributaries, our springs, our river, and that we also can work to make sure we're politically active in a way that will save the St. Johns. So join us at stjohnsriverkeeper.org, and we hope to continue this great conversation moving forward.
All right, great, thank you. And Councilman Dennis, we'll end with you. Oh, I think you're muted.
You're muted.
There he is.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank you, Brandon, and WJCT for hosting this and giving us a platform. I just want to piggyback just what everyone else has said. It takes all of us. This is our river, and it's going to take government, private, the various groups. And one of the things that I do want to just express is that, from a policy standpoint, from an elected official, we need to hear from our constituents, from the community, from the various groups, because, from our end, there's a lot of issues coming our way. And usually the issues that get heard are the ones that are right in our face. So the squeaky wheel gets the oil. And so I just want to encourage all of your listeners to call and really get engaged politically, because that's how we're going to move the needle on a government political level, is to get engaged and get in front of us and start talking why it's important. Why it's important. And again, I just have to piggyback. I want to thank Ms. Reineman, because she was there at the very beginning. And so we need, more people to do it. So again, thank you so much for having me. And, I really am honored to be on a panel such as this.
All right, great. Thank you. Panelists, thank you all so much for being with us here tonight. This was really educational, informative. I hope our audience enjoyed it. I know I did. Big thank you to the audience as well. We really appreciate you being here and supporting WJCT. Keep an eye out for a follow-up email with a post-event survey that should be hitting your inbox shortly. And if you want to know about future events like this or read stories about Northeast Florida, subscribe to the ADAPT newsletter at adaptflorida.org. Next week, you can, if you sign up, you'll get my piece on how St. Augustine is dealing with flooding. Financial support for ADAPT comes from WJCT readers and listeners, with additional support from the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations and the 2040 Foundation. Today's events would not have been possible without the help of James Richardson and the Jacksonville Environmental Protection Board, as well as Dr. Pinto and all of his colleagues who helped put this report together this year. So thank you to everyone involved, and thank you, audience members, for joining us tonight. Stay safe, everyone. Have a good night. And thank you again for being here.
Yep, thank you.
Thank you for being here.